This is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse and more particularly from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And welcome to Midday with Reverend Don. And as you know, if you regularly follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can join the conversation no matter what platform you're watching on by typing your comments or questions on that platform. They will appear here in my chat room, and we can talk directly, which is one of my favorite parts of this broadcast. I want to thank you for joining me. And today we're going to talk about candle magic. Hello to Mary in the chat room. Good to see you, Mary. Hello to Michael. Hello to Ravenwolf in the chat room. Good to see you, Ravenwolf. Welcome, everyone. And we're going to talk about candle magic, what it is, and also where it comes from. And hello to Janet in the chat room. Hello to Mary Cavalcante in the chat room. Hello to Renee in the chat room. It's good to see all of you. Hello, welcome, and we will have a lovely midday chat. Mary says, "I love the necklace." Thank you, Mary. And hello to Antonio in the chat room. It's good to see you, Antonio. And so everybody knows, I'm sure, that candle magic is widely used in magic, that it's a very common form of magic. And candle magic is performing a spell and or prayer focused on the use of a candle. It can be used in many ways, but usually you light the candle to symbolize the spell going forward into being, and often you allow it to burn for a certain length of time. Sometimes you return to it for several days in a row. Hello to Raven in the chat room and Samantha. It's good to see you both. And you allow this to play out. The reason, oh, hello to Brycey in the chat room. It's good to see you, Brycey. The reason that candles are particularly good for magic, there are a couple of them. One of them is that they both have to do with the flame rather than the candle per se. But flame is transformation, and spell work is transformation. Hello to Magical Mermaid in the chat room. Hello to Bradley in the chat room. It's good to see you. But you know, spell work itself is transformation. Hello to Aiden in the chat room. As the fire burns, it transforms the wax of the candle into the light of the flame, whatever kind of wax you may be using. And it represents transformation, so it's part of sympathetic magic. And Brycey asks, wax? Well, I'm sorry, I'm sure you'll get to that. We can. It's only part of what I want to discuss in the history of candle magic. The other thing about candle magic is that in addition to being transformative, flame is energy. I usually recommend that when people are doing magic or meditation, they light one or more candles to raise the energy in the room so that they have more to work with. I also recommend that you use visualization to increase that energy by placing an energy construct, a ball of white light around the flame to make it even stronger. The more candles, the more that function is fulfilled of raising excess energy. Now, the better you are at using energy, the less you need that, but it can still always be helpful. And that's one of the reasons that candles are so popular in modern spells. And you'll notice I say modern. We're going to come back to that. So those two things, the fact that the candle itself gives energy in the same way that you might carry a stone for its properties, the candle has energy and transformation as its properties. And it lends them to the work you're doing. The color of the candle is often considered important. Sometimes its shape, Candles can be had in all kinds of different shapes, or you can carve them, you can paint them, you can customize them in many ways for your magical work. And people who do that in many symbolic ways. You might add writing to reinforce your goal of the spell. You might choose a color that is complementary. If you're making your candles, as some people like to do, you might include stones inside the wax, or herbs inside the wax, or scent, all of which can help to focus that energy. These are all ways that you can focus your candle magic and your candle. Some people really like to make their own candles, and there was a question about wax earlier. And of course, commercial candles are almost always a petroleum product. Have been for a long time now. A lot of people, I think, don't realize that, but candles are a petroleum product. You can get things like beeswax candles that are not a petroleum product, but they will be very clearly labeled as beeswax candles and are usually significantly more expensive. Although there are many people in the community who make these, and if you go to festivals or other events, you can often find them more easily than in the wider world. Historically, there were also candles made from things like tallow, which had their downside. Tallow was very smoky, it didn't smell good, but it was much cheaper than that natural wax. And so in the era when candles were generally used for lighting, many people were using tallow candles. And today they're more or less unheard of because they really were not satisfactory, but at the time they were more of a thing. One of the things we have to bear in mind is that using candles in magic is a comparatively new thing because candles themselves are comparatively new. They do go back in some parts of the world to the period of the Roman Empire or slightly before. In parts of Asia, even a little bit earlier than that. But not in Europe, for example, and in the Roman Empire, we're talking about the latter empire, and they were far less common than oil lamps, for example. And if you look at the Orthodox Christian Church, which comes out of that late antiquity period, you'll see they don't generally use candles, they use oil lamps still, because it is the traditional thing. And Janet says, I like to get mine from blue corn beeswax. It's worth noting that there are today a number of other alternatives as well. You'll find candles made from soy, for example. And John Phillip, hello John Phillip, it's good to see you, says that I can never find or access this live stream until Facebook decides to send me an invitation to it. And when Facebook is ready, the link to the live stream just pops up on my page unexpectedly. That's very odd. Hello, Diane. It's good to see you, Diane. You know, it always is on my Facebook page, and it's always at noon. So if you want to go there, or any of the other pages it appears on, I think it should be possible to find it there quite easily. Or Magic TV, or various other platforms. But why that would be the case, I don't know. But you know, Facebook can be frustrating. So these are all different kinds of wax you can use, and it's a fairly modern thing because until the 1800s, really, maybe late 1700s, candles were expensive. They weren't necessarily something people were going to use in a spell. They were used for lighting, and until the 19th century, they were usually used as lighting for the wealthy. And they had only really come into their own as a lighting source when they were displaced by gas lighting in the early 19th century. Because when you look at, for example, those Rococo palaces with their crystal chandeliers lit by candles, that's not what ordinary people were using. ordinary people were using things like rushlights. They were using things like oil lamps still, which were used throughout the 19th century. If you've ever seen a kerosene lamp, that's a kind of oil lamp, a direct development of the ones that were used in ancient Rome. They never really went out until gaslight and electricity came in. Hello to Brenda in the chat room. Good to see you. Hello to Janet in the chat room. And Janet says, I like to burn birthday candles when a short burn time is appropriate. Birthday candles can be very good for certain spells. Tea lights are very good for certain spells. Hello to Green Skull in the chat room. Good to see you, Green Skull. Bryce C says, I love your ring. Thank you. I love rings. Also, I consider them an artistic expression. This one is actually a combination. One is a dragon. I don't know. I'll hold them up here. And the other is a Celtic motif featuring 3 horses. Because they fit together so beautifully, I like to wear them together. But not always. One was a gift. The other, I simply like the design. And hello to Kazan in the chat room. It's nice to see you, Kazan. It's nice to see everyone. So when we talk about candles in magic, this is a relatively new development. And Green Skull, who says, call me Andy, asks if they can call me Grandpa. Yes, you can. One of the points we've been making these last several months is that I've moved into the grandpa part of my life. And I am seriously trying to bear this in mind and live that life and not let myself be pulled back into the father aspect of life. And I'm actually enjoying being grandfather. There are loose ends that have to be tied up. That's always the case. But my road is that of Grandpa Don at this point. And I have a lot of things I want to do. This is one of them, teaching. If you remember all the way back in February, one of the things I said is that I want to get back to teaching. I want to get back to artwork. I want to be able to do writing. And also, I've started doing psychic work again, which I've been quite enjoying. When I was acting as the chancellor of the Corellian tradition, I didn't have time for these things. Now I do, and I'm quite enjoying that. So let me take a moment for a shameless plug. If you would like a reading from me, you can contact me at donlewishp@aol.com or instant message me on Facebook or Instagram. And I do tarot, I do clairvoyance, I also do past lives. Or you can join my Patreon at revdonlewis.com. So that's our commercial break for today. Just last night we had our weekly chat room. It was lovely. We do lots of things on the Patreon. So getting back to candles and candle magic, one of the things I remember commenting upon, I think sometime last year, and Bryce E says, naked? But that would cost extra. But one of the things I commented on last year, someone had remarked how upset they were to see people saying that white was an all-purpose color for candles, and that you must use exactly the color that was recommended for whatever spell you were doing. And I had to point out that even the ability to have colored candles is very recent. Of course, you can use a white candle for anything, because anyone who was doing candle magic before, I would say really the mid-20th century, certainly the dawn of the 20th century, would have been using white or natural color. All these colors weren't available. They're not traditional. Nor would they have been using them again much before the 18th century. They're very, very new. Diane says, I work Monday nights and always miss your chat. I'm so sorry that we miss you, Diane. But I always love talking to you. And Jim says, I remember my mama using tallow or even butter as a candle base. And yes, butter can be used for candles too. All that a candle really is an oil lamp that's been solidified. Same principle. And just like an oil lamp, the wick pulls up the fuel, which then burns. And Andy says, do you like scented candles? Yes, I personally do. And if your candle is not scented, but you want to use a scent to help focus your spell, you dress the candle with essential oil, or with anointing oil, I should say. Because it doesn't have to be a pure essential oil. It just has to have that scent. And this can be part of your spell. It can be the meditation that you begin the spell with. And other people do not like scented candles. So it's possible to do whatever you want. But if candles are a modern thing, what did people do before them? Did they not do spells like this? Well, yes, they did. They did things very much like this. I think as long as we've been doing magic, but what they did is that they used the predecessors of candles. Oil lamps worked the same way. Before oil lamps, we had open fires. Before fireplaces, most homes had a fire in the center called the hearth. And these certainly were used for magical purposes. They were used for religious purposes. In Roman culture, even after an open fire in the center of the house was no longer common, the hearth, which moved to a corner of the triclinium as a general rule, or to a corner of the atrium, was still used as the center of household worship. And the belief was that the fire, which was the main characteristic of the hearth, was a gateway between the worlds of humankind and the worlds of spirit. And you see this very much in ancient religion. You see it very much in mythology. The story of Cinderella and the fairy godmother touches on that idea of the hearth as the portal of spirit. And these are all aspects of that older practice. Now Jim says, mullein stalks with beeswax make an amazing slow-burning wick for an outdoor fire, an outdoor rite. Jim says it used to be lard, but beeswax burns nicer. Modern conveniences. I would have to agree that the beeswax would burn better. And and what you're describing is basically the same thing as what's called a rushlight. Although mullein is not necessarily what would have been used for it, but that's what a rushlight was. They were used in the same way as candles. And Kazan says that this makes sense because in Diwali, they use the oil and wick method for good fortune. And Andy asks if we can talk about Julius Caesar. Well, we certainly could. What would you like to talk about, Julius Caesar? Caesar is the subject of a very famous anecdote about an omen from a prediction from a soothsayer and a number of omens. Exactly how that transpired, there are various different aspects, and Andy indicates it's the death that that he wants to talk about. My understanding is that Caesar was told by a soothsayer to beware the Ides of March, which is the day that he in fact died. And this has gone down in history as a really big thing. But you know, it's one of those things, did it actually happen? Well, maybe. He also supposedly was warned by his wife, who had a dream the night before, that he was in danger and begged him not to go to the Senate that day. And then in fact, he had, if I remember the story correctly, he had agreed not to go because she was so concerned. But then I think it was Mark Anthony said, well, you can't do that. Everyone's going to be disappointed. You're going to set yourself back. We have to go. We've promised we'll be there. So he went and he was killed. Why was he killed? He was killed because he was believed to be setting up a new monarchy in Rome, and the Senate did not want that. Part of what was spurring that was his relationship with Queen Cleopatra, who was the last standing Hellenistic monarch, and a very formidable person who he had married according to Egyptian law, although he had a separate Roman wife, but he brought Cleopatra to Rome. And to all appearances, it looked as if he was going to declare himself permanent ruler in union with her as Queen of Egypt, unite the two countries, and be the dominant power of the world. And members of the Senate wanted to save the Republic, at least supposedly. The Republic was already very dysfunctional and had been careening from one civil war to another for a while. But they did briefly save the Republic. One of the things Caesar had done that alarmed people was Caesar believed himself, and his family believed themselves to be descended from the goddess Venus. And if I remember correctly, they had added a statue of Queen Cleopatra to their temple of Venus, which was considered to be a step toward legitimizing his marriage to her in Roman eyes. And Rome was terrified of Cleopatra, as they were of all Hellenistic culture, really. The Romans had a schizophrenic relationship to the Greeks. They greatly admired the ancient Greeks, and they were not thrilled with the Hellenistic Greeks, partly because they were right there to be rivals. And Andy asked, was Cleopatra Greek? As far as anyone can show, she was 100% Macedonian Greek. Her family had ruled Egypt for 300 years, since the time of Alexander the Great. And they really did not intermarry outside of the Macedonian royalty. She was the seventh Cleopatra. They tended to use the same names and distinguished themselves with additional names. And Jim says the Memoirs of Cleopatra by Margaret George is a great read if anyone enjoys historical fiction. There are a lot of good books about Cleopatra, some of them better than others. The one thing you have to remember about Cleopatra, if you want to understand this figure, is that she was Hellenistic Greek. Unlike any of her predecessors, she was a strong devotee of traditional Egyptian culture. She spoke Egyptian fluently, as well as at least 7 other languages. She was an intellectual giant of her day, as was Julius Caesar. That's how they bonded, beyond the simple fact of all the power she had to offer, as basically the wealthiest woman in the world that he knew. And their union seems to have been about more than power. They were well matched to each other. She was, to judge from her surviving depictions, a relatively beautiful woman, depending on the standards of the time. But she definitely had those Macedonian features. And there are some images that are relatively certainly known to be her. There are others that are thought to be her because they resemble the portraits we know to be her. And no actress that I know of has ever played her who actually resembled her. But maybe one day. Now, going back to candles, where we started, these were important in Roman worship, since we've been talking about Rome for a few moments. They were fire itself, and the oil lamps were important in Roman temples and altars. The most sacred artifact in Rome was the eternal flame guarded by the Vestal Virgins. They regarded Rome as extraordinarily, or they regarded fire in Rome as extraordinarily powerful. This is part of why we still have candle magic today. It's very old. Um, Andy asks who invented candles, and the answer is nobody can answer that. The earliest candles that I have been able to see are in Asia, um, maybe a century BC. They appear to go farthest back in China, which is true for a lot of things. But nobody recorded when they started using them. They go back a long way in Japan. But outside of those areas, they're more recent innovations. But as I say, they had spread into the Roman Empire by the late antique period, but they were extraordinarily costly, which is why you see them show up in the early Christian church, but not really other places. And for a long time, that was the one place you saw them because they were very expensive and they had the money for it. You might see them in a royal court because they had the money for it. You didn't really see them among ordinary people. Ordinary people were still using oil lamps and rushlights and things like that. But were they using them for magic? I'm quite certain they were, because it's well recorded that people used them for magic before and after, so I'm sure they were using them in that period too. They certainly were using them for ceremonies in things like ceremonial magic. Jim says it's the same with glassware, and yes, it is. Glassware goes all the way back to ancient Egypt, although it was forgotten. Some aspects of it were forgotten at certain points. But for the longest time, it was something that was mostly in the hands of the wealthy. Poor people might occasionally have some. One of the channels I like to follow on YouTube is called American Patriot. And they do things like historical recipes, and they have this little backstory about this couple who live in a log cabin, and he's a woodcutter, and she sometimes works at the local trading post. And they show a lot of things about life at that time in the early 1800s. But one thing that I can't help mentioning is that for the things they have in that log cabin, they're a much wealthier couple than that backstory makes out to be. There are a lot of ways that we've forgotten what life was like before we were so wealthy. Now, Kazan says, a long time ago I learned that if you want to make a specific color of candle, you can melt crayons with your wax, and it works. And yes, it will do that. That is a good way to color a candle if you're making it yourself, rather than having to go out and buy wax or to buy a wax dye. You can use crayons. There are many things you can do if you're making them. One thing that many people like to do is to put herbs in them. I think I mentioned essential oil. You can get scent that's made just for this purpose. There are a lot of things you can do if you're making your candle, and once you've made it, you can carve it, you can paint on it. You can include things in it like treasure candles that used to be very popular. You could, for example, have a charm that represents the attainment of your spell, put it in the candle with the intent that when the wax has melted to the point that the charm is exposed, the spell will have come to pass. All kinds of things you can do with candle magic. And if you ever want a really good book on candle magic, I highly recommend Candle Magic by Jane Auer from Eschaton Press. It is very good for this subject. With that, I see we've come to the end of our half hour. I hope you've enjoyed the program. Again, if you're interested in my Patreon, you can find it at revdonlewis.com. If you're interested in my books and other books and videos, you can find them at corellianpublishing.com. If you would like a reading, you can message me on Facebook or Instagram, or email me at donlewishp@aol.com. And I thank you for joining. I love you all. Jim says, thank you for making lunchtime educational. It's my pleasure. I enjoy having these talks. And let us close, as we always do, with our prayer. And Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for the role you play in our lives and for all the inspiration you send our way. And we ask you to help us to keep our minds elastic and open so that we always have a steady supply of new and creative ideas. new things to try in our life, creative things to do, to keep us happy and involved. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great love and respect, and knowing you're always with us, but from respect, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. And I thank you for your presence. I love spending this time with you. I love you all. I'll hope to see you tomorrow, and may you be blessed now and always.